In the 1970s, Dr. Louis Leakey hired a young, not formally educated but curious Jane Goodall to observe chimpanzees in the Gombe National Park in Tanzania. Dr. Leakey, who was an anthropologist, hired Jane to observe chimpanzees so perhaps we could learn more about our primitive natural history. Jane observed what is now known as the Kasakela troop. Over the course of 4 years, she witnessed the troop display the fusion-fission dynamics that is normal for any chimpanzee troop. However, one subgroup splintered off on its own and didn't display the typical behavior of a subgroup. Normally, a subgroup would go off on its own, but still engage in a lot of social behaviors with the main group. So we're talking eating, grooming, playing with each other. All that stuff is normal. Increasingly, this subgroup stopped socializing with the main group, but things really escalated when 6 members of the Kasakela group ganged up on a lone member of the subgroup, resulting in a vicious and fatal attack that shocked scientists. This was the catalyst that resulted in 4 years of bloodshed that resulted in eliminating the subgroup altogether and left Jane Goodall traumatized. While scientists to this day are reluctant to call this war, warfare, or genocide, the events witnessed was a kind of tribalism that's all too familiar to us humans. This is the story of the Gombe Chimpanzee War, and if you are the first person to answer the name of the only female chimpanzee that was killed in this event that we know of, you'll be the pinned comment in today's video. Also, as a warning, the contents of this event are kind of graphic in nature and also kind of heartbreaking, so viewer discretion is advised. The Kasakela troop was the main chimpanzee troop Jane Goodall was assigned to study. The main objective of this research, led by Dr. Louis Leakey, was to use chimpanzees as a proxy to our evolutionary and primitive past. That is to say that we can't really tell the temperament, relationship, or tool use with the fossils we are finding of our ancestors. So, with chimpanzees being our closest living relatives, and more representative, so to speak, of our ancestors, Dr. Leakey had hoped that by studying chimpanzees' behaviors and social structures, we could get a better idea of how our ancestors like Homo habilis or Australopithecus potentially behaved and bonded. I'm sorry, I don't really know how to pronounce some of these really long Latin names that I don't use often. So the Kasakela troop consisted of 50 individuals, and their territory was kind of mid compared to what is considered normal. While chimpanzees' territories can be anywhere between 10 to 60 square miles, the Kasakela territory was about 20 square miles. At the time that Jane Goodall arrived on site, so we're talking in the 1960s, the Kasakela was a unified troop. And as I said, the fusion-fission dynamics were being displayed as normal, meaning there's always this main troop that consists of most of the members, but then some of the members will break off and go off and do their own thing within the main group's territory. But they always will interact on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis, whatever, with the main group with no conflicts at all. And of course, during this time, Jane Goodall was discovering that they use tools, that they hunt down animals and eat meat, and that they form these complex social bonds and even have personalities associated with them. But flash forward to 1971, something happened with the Kasakela troop. The alpha male at the time died. Now, I will say in me researching this event, this male was always referred to as the alpha male, but of course, at this point in time, Jane Goodall was researching this group for 11 years, so he probably had a name, and I saw that this alpha male's name was either Mike or Leakey. It probably was Leakey, but I can't really say for sure. But he landed up dying, and then this new male named Humphrey kind of took over as the alpha male. Now, as I mentioned in my chimpanzee video, which I'm just going to say you'll hear me referring back to my chimpanzee video or my Jane Goodall video. And that's because this video is kind of the third of an unofficial 3-part series where a couple weeks ago I did a video about Jane Goodall and talked about the discoveries she found when she was observing the chimpanzees, and then a little bit more about the Jane Goodall Institute and stuff like that. And then there's also a video about chimpanzee biology and ecology. And that's where I really took a deep dive in how they behave in ecosystems. So as I mentioned in my chimpanzee video, alpha males will oftentimes take over the alpha position through either forming strong bonds with the other members in their troop, or they could kind of come in hot with like just sheer aggression and brute. And it seems as though Humphrey wasn't really that great at forming strong bonds, so he was coming in more so with that like sheer aggression. While most of the Kasakela troop kind of conceded to Humphrey's alpha status, Humphrey was often being challenged by his brother duo named Charlie and Hugh. And it seemed like the challenges were being initiated more so by Charlie, but he always had his older brother to kind of back him up in it all. And so this is just to say that when Humphrey took alpha position, Hugh and Charlie kind of resisted that status being bestowed upon him. But the thing is when an alpha male is challenged to opposition for alpha status, it's usually like on a one-on-one basis where the opponent has like a clan of supporters or alliances kind of backing him, but the physical challenge itself is always on a one-to-one basis. And usually the male will admit or communicate defeat with like this really low grunting noise. However, being challenged with like a 2-to-1 dynamic, a 2-to-1 dynamic is kind of unlikely, and therefore the alpha male probably wouldn't communicate that level of defeat. And so all this did really was just kind of create this dominant struggle between the three males. But in response to that, Charlie and Hugh formed a subgroup consisting of 7 males and 4 females, and then their young. The males consisted of Hody, Day, Hugh, Goliath, Charlie, Willy Wally, and Sniff. And then the females that were part of this group included Madam B, her daughters Honeybee and Little Bee, Mandy, and Wanda. Now, I also mentioned Goliath in the Jane Goodall video because Goliath was kind of part of the OG chimpanzees that she was studying when she first arrived at Gombe. And I had mentioned that Jane Goodall had a favorite chimpanzee, and his name was Mr. Graybeard. And Mr. Graybeard, who actually at this point in time, he had been dead. He died shortly after Jane Goodall arrived. Like, they think he died somewhere between like 1961 and 1962. But regardless, Jane Goodall oftentimes saw Mr. Graybeard kind of like caressing the back of Goliath's head. And at the time I didn't find any information about like Goliath's personality or his temperament, but because he was always getting the back of his head caressed, I got the sense that Goliath was maybe kind of shy, a little anxious or whatever. And it turns out in doing a little bit more research about this event, the Gombe Chimpanzee War, that that assumption was correct. Goliath was a very friendly and kind of timid chimpanzee, and actually in 1964 he was the alpha male of the Kasakela troop. Even though he wasn't an alpha male at the time, he was still considered high-ranking with the Kasakela troop and overall pretty friendly with the troop. So it was a little weird why Goliath would have left in the first place, but he landed up going on with this group and sticking with this subgroup, never to really fusion back with the main group ever again. Now, as I say that, one of the youngest members, his name was Sniff, he had a really special relationship with Goliath in the sense that Sniff was this young male kind of starting to gain some independence and learning how to navigate as like an independent male chimpanzee. He often was hanging out with Goliath frequently, so it was almost like Goliath and Sniff had this like mentor-mentee type of relationship. And who knows, this is me kind of interjecting my own personal assumptions, but maybe Goliath saw that Sniff was hanging out with this group more often, and Goliath just kind of wanted to be there for his mentee or something like that. Now, at face value, it was normal to see this happen, right? Subgroups would form all the time. They kind of go off within the main territory and just kind of do their own thing. And I had said in my chimpanzee videos that these subgroups are forming for many reasons, but it seems to be that they form to reduce aggression among the group, and this subgroup forming could have been in response to that. but also just to spread out access to resources and then mating opportunities. What's different with this group is it almost seems as though it was an act of rebellion led by Hugh and Charlie. And so it wasn't noticed immediately, but over time, the scientists noticed that there was something else going on with this subgroup. They were typically hanging out in the southern area of the main Kasakela territory. And again, this is something that is fairly normal. But over the course of like 3.5 years, they were just noticing that this subgroup was not socializing with the main group in the kind of same dynamic that you would see in a normal, healthy fission-fusion dynamic. And then it appeared as though the greater Kasakela troop redefined its territory to exclude that southern area where the other group was hanging out entirely. And it was at that point in time that scientists kind of thought they were witnessing some permanent split with the troop, and they started to dub that subgroup as the Kahama troop. I do just want to say that in 1972, so it was like a year after this subgroup formed, Hugh went missing. So Hugh was the older of the brother duo that was constantly challenging Humphrey and also one of the leaders of this group. So he went missing a year after this group formed, and it's really unclear if he went into a different community, which that does not happen very often. As I mentioned in my chimpanzee video, it's usually the females that leave the groups, and then males usually stick with the same group that they're born in. That could have happened though. Also, there was a polio outbreak that was kind of, sweeping through the chimpanzee populations at the time. He could have gotten ill and died, and the scientists just weren't able to find his body. Or it's possible that he was really the first fatality from this war, and researchers just weren't around to witness it happening. So he just went missing. They never saw him again. The cause of death or the fact that he's not with the troop anymore is kind of unknown. But then in January 1974, 6 adults, so this is Humphrey, Figgin, Homeo, Sherry, Everett, and Rudolph, all of which are from the Kasakela group, went down to the southern region for their normal patrol route. And then they spotted Hody from the Kahama troop. He was feeding on some fruit in a tree, and he was alone. It's reported that the 6 members of the Kasakela troop became silent and then stealthily climbed the trees and circled Hody, who didn't notice that he was being surrounded until it was too late. Now, it's reported that he quickly jumped down from the tree and took off running. And then the rest of the Kasakela members jumped down and followed him. It's reported that Humphrey caught him first, grabbing his leg, effectively tripping him. Then Humphrey lifted him from his leg and threw him down on the ground. As the rest of the group caught up, they began to hold him down. They punched him, they stomped on him, they bit him. Even another member took a large rock and actually threw it at him as he was lying down on the ground. And this attack lasted for about 10 minutes. And when they stopped, there was no movement from Hody. However, the scientists were watching him for several minutes, and after several minutes, Hody was able to hoist himself up and then limp away, but he was never seen again. So researchers believe that he probably died from his injuries later on. After this attack, the members of the Kahama group were kind of picked off one by one, especially for the males. The second assault was on Day. Now, he was beaten to near death by Sherry, Homeo, Everett, and Gigi in a very similar manner, right? So they stomped on him, they bit him, they threw things at him, and they punched him, and they held him down. And again, when those members kind of figured that they were done, they left the area, and several minutes go by, and then Day hoisted himself up and limped away. Now, he was seen for about 2 months after this attack, but then he was never seen again. So he either died of his injuries, or it's possible that some other members of the Kasakela troop finished him off with another assault. Nearly a year later, the third victim became Goliath. So again, this was the former alpha male of the greater Kasakela troop. He was generally friendly and well regarded with the group in its entirety. And his assault really shocked scientists because there was something different in what the other troop members did to him, but also because of Goliath's temperament, his demise was really heartbreaking. So it's reported that as the members of the Kasakela troop surrounded Goliath, he approached them in a friendly manner, kind of like you're meeting up with some strangers and you know that you've been kind of estranged, but there's no hard feelings. Then Felblum charged Goliath and held him down. Now, supposedly Goliath just didn't have the heart to fight back, or perhaps he was just so shocked by the violence that was being bestowed upon him. But the researchers witnessed this attack and they were all shocked as they went ahead and did the same thing. They were biting him, punching him, stomping on him, throwing things at him. And what really shocked them is when they watched Felblum, another member from the Kasakela group, take Goliath's leg and actually twisted it. Something that the researchers observed chimpanzees doing in an attempt to dismember colobus monkeys that they've hunted down. That was something they never seen before. And of course, this lasted several minutes. And like all the other fights, Goliath was beaten to near death. And then after this attack, he presumably limped away, but we never saw him again. They never found his body or anything like that. But like all the others, they figured he probably died of his injuries, a few hours later. So after Goliath died, that means that 4 of the 7 males went missing or were dead. The females thus far have been spared up till the Kasakela group caught up to Madam B, and she was hanging out with her daughters Honey Bee and Little Bee back in 1974. Now, Madam B, she was assaulted numerous times over the course of a year until they finally fatally attacked her. As far as we know, she is the only female that researchers can confirm was killed by the Kasakela troop. So there she was, hanging out with her daughters, Honey Bee and Little Bee, when the members surrounded her and they began attacking her. You know the drill. Biting, stomping, punching, throwing things at her. And in a weird turn of events, when Madam B was down on the ground laying prostrate, Honey Bee stayed with her, and Honey Bee was young at the time. She wasn't even fertile. But really what astonished researchers is that Little Bee, so the older sister, followed the main group and essentially reintegrated with them. Now, Madam B was assaulted 4 times that we know of. And the reason why I say that is because researchers were able to witness Madam B getting assaulted 4 times, but oftentimes when they kind of like reassembled to observe the chimpanzees later on, Madam B had like new and fresh wounds on her. So it's thought that maybe she did get assaulted a couple other times and the researchers just weren't there to see it. Now, nearly a year later after that first attack, in the fall of 1975, researchers saw Madam B surrounded by other members of the Kasakela troop. This was Figgin, Satan, Homeo, and Sherry. And again, she was being beaten. Also, what was astounding is that Little Bee was perched up on a tree, kind of sitting there by the sidelines, not participating in the fighting, but at least watching it. During this assault, the Kasakela members would stop, and then Madam B would try to pick herself up. And if one of the males saw her trying to pick herself up, they would all kind of charge her again and beat her again until she couldn't get up. After they decided they were done and they left the area, and researchers looked for her over the next couple of days, and they really only saw her because they saw Honey Bee up in a tree with her mother below her. And it's reported that Honey Bee actually kind of like took care of her mom for at least 4 days until finally Madam B passed away from the injuries. Now, with Honey Bee, she occasionally reintegrated with the Kasakela troop, but it was never something that was permanent. And then when she became fertile, she left the Kasakela troop and went to her birth troop, because as I said, it's usually females that leave, that will leave their troop. But she returned to her birth troop, and I didn't see any reports that she had a baby, but I mean, since she was fertile, she probably was going back there to mate. However, she didn't stay very long with even that troop, and so scientists kind of lost sight of her after she left the birth troop and then never came back to Kasakela.
Hey y'all, I want to interrupt the story with saying if you found this video endearing and educational, please hit that like and subscribe button. It would mean a lot to me, especially this time around, because I do all the editing myself, and all the keyframing for the animations for this video was quite an undertaking. And getting this video to spread to more people would just mean a lot to me, because this video did take a long time to edit. So thank you, and let's get back to it.
So right around the time that Madam B died from her final assault, Charlie went missing. Now, as I said, there was this polio outbreak that was kind of impacting chimpanzee populations all across the area. And Charlie was indeed dying from polio, so he was already in quite a weakened state. And researchers didn't see exactly what happened, but it's reported that some fishermen were fishing along a stream nearby, and they had told the researchers that they heard a commotion in the trees. Sounded like it was a pretty bad screeching match. And then a few days later, researchers kind of went to the area where the fishermen said all the screeching took place. And then they saw Charlie, his body laying there with wounds that are consistent with being brutally attacked, just like all the other males. So now we have just two males. Willy Wally, he also was dying from polio, and he eventually just kind of went missing. So scientists think that he could have gotten attacked, but they didn't see it. Or, polio finally could have taken him out. So now we're left with Sniff, and then Wanda and Mandy. Now, Sniff evaded attacks for nearly a year before the Kasakela troop caught up to him, and that was in November of 1977. In November of 1977, Figgin, Satan, and Goblin caught up to him, and then they're screeching. So basically, as the attacks were starting and all the commotion started to erupt, all of that brought in Homeo, Everett, and Sherry onto the scene. By the time Homeo, Sherry, and Everett arrived to join in on the beatings, Figgin, Satan, and Goblin had already pummeled Sniff pretty badly. And in an almost ritualistic manner to symbolize the war was over, it is reported that Satan cupped Sniff's bloodied and bludgeoned head and drank his blood as it rolled off of his face. Now, this was one of the scenes that traumatized Jane Goodall, and she recalls this scene nearly decades later.
And there was a no man's land between them, and they would show typical territorial behavior and call loudly. And then the males of the larger Kasakela community began systematically invading the heart of this territory the Southerners had carved out for themselves. And if they found an individual attacking brutally and leaving them to die of their wounds, they annihilated an entire community that way. It was like a civil war, really. They treated them in ways that we've never seen them treat an individual of their own community, ways which you see when they're hunting and trying to kill an adult prey animal. It was horrible. I mean, cupping the victim's head as he lay bleeding with blood pouring from his nose and drinking the blood, twisting a limb to try and twist it off, tearing pieces of skin with their teeth. Never see that in a fight within a community. And yet these were individuals they traveled with, fed with, played with, grown up with. It's what we do. We dehumanize the enemy. And that does indeed is what happens in genocide. The people have grown up together.
Even after that, Satan and Sherry then dragged Sniff down a hill and continued to beat him. Again, he was accosted to near death. He was able to hoist himself up and then limp away. And Sniff was seen for about a day or so until he was never seen again. Now, so then this leaves us with the remaining females. We don't really know what happened to them. It is possible that with no male being present to kind of represent their group, that they decided to integrate into one of the nearby groups. And right over by the southern border of their territory, there was another group called the Kalanda group. So they could have integrated with them, but at the same rate, some of the researchers think that because they didn't really spare Madam B at all, it's possible that the Kasakela troop also killed them as well. But for the record, for the most part, we don't really know what happened to them. But regardless, whether the Kahama group were brutally beaten, went missing, or integrated back into the Kasakela troop or some kind of neighboring group, in a matter of just 4 years, the troop was completely eliminated. The Kasakela troop still had some conflicts to fight with bordering troops from the south and then from the north. The former territory of the Kahama was essentially up for grabs, and you would think that because that used to be the Kasakela territory, that they would be able to just kind of reabsorb it back as part of their like larger territory. But that's not what happened. The neighboring Kalanda group was putting up a fight for that piece of land. And the Kalanda group was much larger than the Kasakela troop. And so there were territorial disputes that also resulted in some vicious attacks. And the fallout from that conflict actually resulted in Humphrey. So the alpha male that kind of like started this all. I don't want to put all the blame on him. Anyways, he landed up dying along with another male from the Kasakela troop. And it meant that the Kasakela troop had to kind of shift their territory further up north. Once they did that shift further up north, then they met conflict with the Matumba troop. And the Matumba troop also was much larger than the Kasakela troop. However, the Kasakela troop had a higher than normal number of juvenile males. So while they wouldn't normally participate in kind of like the physical confrontations over territory, it is believed that the juveniles like screams and screeches used to kind of like defend the territory. It made it sound like the Kasakela troop actually had more males than there actually were. And that meant that the Matunda kind of retreated a little bit. And so all that is to say that when it was all said and done, all three of those tribes kind of like redefined and redrew their territories, and then balance was kind of restored once again. Now, when Jane Goodall was discovering all of these things about chimpanzees, the tool use, the hunting, and then, of course, this event, the public was being informed on these discoveries like pretty much in real time. It was all happening fairly quickly. And when the public learned about the violence of this war, it shocked and horrified them. After all, I think we all have a little bit of like a romanticized relationship with nature. Like, I know I definitely have mentioned it in other videos that I have out there, that I think about like, oh, the cute babies, or, just an animal that might be relaxing, sunning itself in like a field or whatever. And it's something that's really soothing and things like that. But then you learn that we're kind of just all on this planet eating each other. And when you become a prey animal, it's not like you're going down very easily. Like, it is horrific. Like, it's bad. Like, it is really bad. Like, some of the wounds that these chimpanzees get from these fights. What I'm getting at is, in order to observe the chimpanzees better, because the terrain was uneven, and from what I understand, like that whole Gombe stream area, it's very hilly, dense vegetation. Studying the chimpanzees was quite an undertaking just to kind of navigate through the terrain that was there. And so one of the unconventional practices that Jane implemented for her research was they had these feeding stations. So it would bring the chimpanzees to the research center so they could better observe the chimpanzees that way. And so at first, the public blamed Jane Goodall, citing that none of the killings would have happened if she didn't feed the chimpanzees in the way that she did, because at the time there were sometimes some conflicts that were happening where chimps were kind of fighting over the bananas that they were being fed. And the researchers did take note of like the rift kind of taking place when they noticed those of the subgroup weren't really coming to the feeding stations anymore. So like they were literally passing up free food in order to not interact with troop members, presumably that they didn't like. So the public thought Jane Goodall and her research team were kind of like responsible for all the violence that was unfolding. However, there was a study done in 2014 that kind of refuted this evidence, that there is no conclusive correlation that human interference causes chimpanzees to be more violent. In fact, this type of violence is very typical for chimpanzees. This is typical when chimps encounter members from other troops. This was kind of the first time that we saw in-group violence. But can you really call it in-group violence? What happened to the Kasakela troop was like this rare event in seeing a troop permanently split. Like, scientists have tracked the Y chromosome, which is the chromosome that males have, in order to construct family trees for kind of like the whole troop in its entirety. And in doing that, they could kind of see how long the troop has stayed together. And the results have shown that some of the oldest groups have stayed together for up to 2,000 years, while the youngest is maybe just shy of over 100. So it does seem like these shifts, this permanent split, is something that is actually really, really rare. Now, Jane's field notes have recently become digital, and so researchers have been able to review the social dynamics and other activities that were kind of documented during the time when all of this was happening. And that way they could kind of come up with hypotheses to understand why this happened, because outside of what we have seen in Gogo recently, which I will get into in just a bit, the cause of the permanent split is still kind of unknown. First of all, if you remember, that one alpha male landed up dying, and there was basically like this dominant struggle between Humphrey, Hugh, and Charlie. And it's possible that the Kasakela troop actually didn't come to a consensus on who should be the alpha male. And so the troop members started to take sides, right? So that could have happened. Also, when you look at the male to female ratio back then, it was pretty high and not normal for a chimpanzee troop. So in addition to like the male to sex ratio being somewhat unbalanced and being highly skewed towards males, it's also reported that the females that were in the Kasakela troop were either too young to reproduce, or the females were already like, they weren't in estrus, so they weren't interested in mating. And so overall, that just kind of created an environment that was really frustrating for the males. Now, typically a healthy male to female sex ratio in a chimpanzee troop is 1 to 1.2. So it's nearly a 1-to-1 ratio. But that is to say that if there is a chimpanzee troop that consists of 50 chimpanzees, it would be healthy and normal for there to be 23 to 24 males and then 26 to 27 females. And so when you kind of combine all of those together, it's likely that those things led to, the permanent split and then subsequent violence. But the part that I still don't get is why it appears as though the Kasakela troop was the one that was seeing the Kahama troop as kind of the others. If you really think back to all of the events and everything that the scientists actually witnessed, it was always the members of the Kasakela troop, and they were the one initiating the attacks and subsequent killings. But something switched with those of the Kasakela troop, where they looked at those of the Kahama troop as some kind of like threat to their survivability, maybe mating opportunity or resources or whatever. And I mentioned just a few minutes ago, there's this other instance where it seems to be happening as well, and that's in the Ngogo troop. And there's very similar parallels. So this is taking place in the Kabale National Park in Uganda. And like in Gombe, there seems to be a noticeable shift in relationships, and this particularly happened after a alpha male died. And at that point, these 3 groups instead of 2 kind of split off, and they were doing their own things. And the 3 groups consist of the Western, the Central, and the Eastern groups. Also, like Gombe, one of the groups is acting as the aggressor, and that is the Western group. The group of scientists that are studying the Ngogo troop is still gathering data to kind of piece together everything that's happening. It's strange, I guess you could say, that they are starting to notice that a rift happened after one of the alpha males died, and there seems to be some kind of like dominant struggle that's happening. But there could be other factors that are playing a role as well. So it's probably too premature to say that all of that contributes to the permanent split, but there are some parallels between what they're seeing happening in Ngogo now and then the Gombe chimpanzees. What can be said is that chimpanzees being violent is kind of just a natural thing for them. And killing members from other communities seems to be an adaptive strategy to increase resource access, gain territory, and then mates. But again, the difference is that this was once a cohesive, unified troop. And whatever it is that caused the split, where the Kasakela troop was looking at the Kahama troop as like the others or rivals, it's just still really baffling to see that. Even when looking at the violence, especially with the Kasakela troop, something else was different. Now, when chimpanzees have these like violent territorial disputes and encounters, usually the attackers make sure the job is done. Meaning the attackers make sure their rivals were dead when they left Whereas with the chimpanzees in Gombe, they kind of like spared them, so to speak, even though they landed up dying a little bit later. In the end, though, the Gombe Chimpanzee War was something that deeply impacted those witnessing it, and it goes to show that life on this planet isn't all baby animals and us sunning ourselves. There is a dark side to nature. And think about all the dark shit that is happening right now in the human world. And think about the people that are fighting to avoid the conflict, the people who are honoring their loved ones, and the people who are invested in future generations, even if they don't have kids. The Kasakela was a fairly large troop, but in the war, it seemed as though the same handful of chimps were kind of identified as the aggressors. So maybe there were a lot of members from the Kasakela troop that held back and just didn't know how to stop the violence. I think we all can relate to that. But all of that is something that we will never know because, well, we're not chimpanzees. But at the same rate, it's relatable to feel the sadness as a chimp with a friendly personality gets killed, or identifying the tenderness of a young chimpanzee staying with her beaten and battered mother until she dies. It's all sad, all too relatable, and all too familiar. That's gonna do it for today, guys. Please like and subscribe, and I'll just see you in the next one. Bye.